Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. India and Pakistan signed the Indus Waters Treaty in 1960. Over the years, Pakistan has regularly expressed concern about India's lack of respect for its end of the bargain. A mandated visit of the Pakistan Commissioner for Indus Waters was delayed 4 times by India, but was finally allowed a few days ago. At issue is India's stated aim to use as much of the Western River's waters as possible. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're joined by Dr. Hassan Abbas, who is a hydrology and water expert. He's joining us from the Pakistani capital, Islamabad. Dr. Abbas holds a PhD in hydrology and water resources, plus has water sector experience spanning North America, Europe, the Middle East, Far East, Oceania, and South Asia. We're also joined by Mr. Ahmed Bilal Sufi, who is an international law expert, joining us from right here in Lahore. He's a former federal law minister and international law expert and former caretaker minister, as I said. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us and for taking your time out of your busy schedules to speak to us here in the Scope. Mr. Sufi, I'd like to start with you, if I may. From a law perspective, what is your point of view on the Indus Waters Treaty and, of course, Pakistan's complaints within that framework?
Well, Indus Water Treaty, I believe, is a positive development between India and Pakistan and between two hostile neighbors for obvious reasons, that it makes a legal distribution of water possible between an upper and lower riparian in respect of the entire Indus basin and makes this distribution. But my concern about the treaty is that it was done in 1960 and a lot of issues were left out of the treaty, which developed subsequently what we call water law jurisprudence. And that jurisprudence demands that now Pakistan and India, without scrapping the treaty, of course, may wish to revisit some of those aspects, such as relating to environment, such as relating to minimum water flow in the rivers that were given to India, and such as removing Pakistan's concern about India's potential to retain more water through making pondages over 20, 30 years period of time, which it plans to do, which creates a water security matters.
Okay, so Dr. Abbas, do you agree with that? Do you think that the treaty itself needs to be possibly revisited in its current shape, not of course annulled, but revisited? And of course, how do you feel about Pakistan's concerns within it?
Well, Rizvi, I see this in a completely different perspective, this Indus Water Treaty. I don't even consider that this is a treaty, because the way this treaty was signed, none of the treaties in the world had ever been signed like that. Because, the treaty is when you start at two ends. There are two parties involved, they're starting at two different ends, and they meet somewhere in between, and then they sign a treaty. Here, one party started at one end, which was India. They said we want all 3 eastern rivers and we want 7% from the western rivers. That is how India's initial position was. Pakistan, on the other hand, had the initial position that Pakistan should keep on using the waters of eastern rivers as much as it was using before the partition, and it should use 100% of the western rivers. That was the starting position, which was put up to World Bank by both countries separately. And at the end, like in 1961, about 6 or 7 years of negotiations and everything, finally what we got out of the treaty is that India gets 100% eastern rivers and they get some 7% allocation in the western rivers. So where's the treaty? This is not a treaty.
Okay. Let me add another voice to this conversation. We're also now joined by Ambassador Shafkat Kakakhail, who is the chairperson of the board of the Sustainable Development Policy Institute. He's also a former deputy executive director of the UN's Environment Program and is also former, in fact, Assistant Secretary General of the UN. Ambassador Kakakhail, thanks for joining us here in the Scope and for taking your time out to speak to us. Ambassador, what do you make of the Indus Waters Treaty and Pakistan's contemporary concerns about Indian actions within that treaty?
Well, the Indus Water Treaty, which was negotiated with the help of the World Bank and which was signed in September 1960, was basically about determining the rights of India and Pakistan on the rights of the rivers, the 6 rivers of the Indus Basin. The Indus Water Treaty, we must remember, is not a water sharing agreement. It is a treaty which divided the rivers, giving the Indians complete access to the 3 eastern rivers, Ravi, Sutlej, Beas, and giving Pakistan the western rivers, the Indus and Chenab and Jhelum,
Right.
Along with some uses allowed to India, including the hydropower plants on the basis of run-of-the-river projects, so that there is no permanent storage, and you only use as much water as is needed to run the turbines.
Right.
So this is an agreement that was negotiated, and Pakistan agreed because India was not willing to share the waters of the eastern rivers.
Okay.
And
if I may just come in, Ambassador, because I will come back to you, but I wanted to bring back in Mr. Sufi. Mr. Sufi, I'm looking at the timeline of Pakistan's concerns ever since this treaty was signed. And, Pakistan has raised the alarm a number of times and objections a number of times over these years since 1960, since this treaty was signed, especially, of course, in recent years as well. Do you think that there is legitimate concern here about what India's intentions are vis-a-vis these waters, whether it be water sharing that we call it or otherwise, the division, as Ambassador there put it, of these rivers?
Well, my concern about Indian intention is there, and this occurred or kind of got reinforced, I think, a couple of years back when the Prime Minister Modi considered very seriously to cancel this treaty or annul this treaty on certain grounds which were alien to the text of the treaty. It was seriously considered, and before that, whenever one would meet with Indian colleagues in any international conference, and one would say that, look, you have a strong bargaining position, whether it be your ability to control the water flow, they would say, no, the treaty guarantees this, and there is no way to cancel a treaty. And this is what they have been saying for the last 20 years plus. But a couple of years back, when the Prime Minister's office convened a formal meeting to consider cancellation of this treaty, that was a very serious development from a legal point of view, from a regional point of view, and from an international law point of view, that you have a binding treaty, howsoever it has been negotiated. As one of my colleagues earlier said, they could have been much better negotiated, but all said and done, whatever the terms of negotiations have been now finalized in the treaty, even walking out of that would, in my view, be viewed as an act of serious hostility by the Indian side. So this has raised alarms, and this has become now a serious issue, that India can come back to this possible threat of cancelling the treaty and trying to control the water flow or do anything in that context. So therefore, Pakistan will need to do its own homework to safeguard against such a possibility, either build its own bondages, reservoirs as a low riparian, or to take up this matter at international forums if the need be.
Dr. Abbas, do you share that concern? And I imagine you do. You said that this wasn't a treaty as you've understood it, of course, Dr. Abbas. But let's just for a moment then talk about the fact that whatever may be in this treaty, however flawed, do you think even within the framework that we can trust Indian intentions vis-a-vis this treaty? Because, we already have talk of, for example, in 1984, Pakistan had objected to India building infrastructure for its use on the Jhelum River, for example. And India, at that time at least, had eventually stopped such building. But Prime Minister Modi has now said he will possibly restart that. And as Mr. Sufi there said, India has very genuinely spoken about leaving this treaty as well a number of times recently. How concerning is all of that, Dr. Abbas?
I don't see India leaving the treaty should be a huge concern for us. It could be an opportunity for us, as a matter of fact. Because the way I see it, this treaty is not compatible with the natural hydrology of the rivers. It is not compatible with the contemporary way things are being managed around water sector all over the world. This treaty is completely oblivious of anything like environmental concerns, which are today at the top agenda everywhere in the world. You see those sustainability development goals, they have evolved out of Millennium Development Goals, and the next we are going to have most likely regeneration goals, where we would not just be sustaining the degraded ecosystems, we would be actually returning to the natural conditions where these ecosystems were like 200 years ago. So that's where the world is going. And if the two countries, like they did in 1950s, if they keep doing that, that's not going to do any favor to the citizen or either side of the border. I think this treaty can become neither useful nor useless. It would just become irrelevant if today we adopt the contemporary way of managing water on either side of the border. And even if the other side, which is not under our control, even if we start doing the contemporary water management on our side, I think this treaty could be rendered irrelevant, because this treaty is based on a couple of economic engines which are created out of flowing rivers. One of those economic engines is development of hydropower, and the second one is irrigation. There is no third significant economic engine which is invoked through this treaty.
All right, so now let me put those points, if you allow me, to the ambassador. Ambassador Kagakhel, do you agree with the criticism of this treaty, A? And B, Ambassador, the narrative about this treaty in the Western world, at least, is a very positive one, isn't it? Especially when it comes to the World Bank. But obviously, that would be expected to be talking about this in very positive terms, saying that, for 56 years, this treaty has ensured peaceful resolution of any objections that are raised, mostly, of course, by the Pakistani side, as we well know. Is this, or has this been a successful treaty, A, and do you think it needs to be changed because of Pakistani concerns?
There are a number of points that I would like to make. First, the Indus Water Treaty was negotiated during the 1950s, the decade of 1950s, and this was when there was no international law governing international rivers which are shared by more than one country. The Indus Water Treaty was the best that Pakistan could hope to get, and this is what Ayub Khan said at the time of the signing of the agreement with Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. In my own personal view, Pakistan agreed to the Indus Water Treaty for a number of reasons. The first reason was that the western rivers, the three western rivers, which were allotted to Pakistan, along with some limited uses to India, carried more than 80% of the waters of the Indus Basin. The three eastern rivers had more or less 20% of the flows of the Indus Basin. The second point why Pakistan agreed to this treaty was the promise of additional storage which was negotiated by the World Bank in the form of the Indus Water Civil Works, which comprised two large reservoirs, Tarbela and Mangla, 8 link canals, 3 barrages, and several hundred tube wells in the private and the public sector. And the World Bank was able to mobilize funds, which in today's dollars would be more than $25 billion. So basically, it was because of these two factors. Pakistan was also aware that being a lower riparian, it could not force India's hand, and it could not perpetuate the status quo, which was the starting negotiation position of Pakistan. Now what has happened is the first decade of the Indus Water Treaty, there was no dispute. The disputes, all the disputes between India and Pakistan over the Indus Water Treaty relates to the hydropower generation plants that India was allowed to build. And but for that, there is a mechanism. One of the most distinguishing features of the Indus Water Treaty is the elaborate dispute settlement mechanism.
Ambassador, I'm going to come in just because, and I will allow you to come back in with those details. But I wanted to put those points, if you allow me, to Mr. Sufi as well. Mr. Sufi, earlier on you mentioned that India has brought in issues which are alien to the treaty itself, as bearing influence over its decision-making vis-a-vis whether it will carry through with the treaty or not. And I wanted to hone in on that for a moment, because the fact of life is that political realities will and do play a part in all of this, don't they? And I wanted to get your thoughts then about, for example, the Modi government at this point in time and its train of thought when it comes to all this, because as you said and other guests have said, they have threatened to walk away. They've threatened to use, beyond what they're allowed to when it comes to the Western rivers, etc. Can all of that be resolved? Can the Indians be trusted at this time?
Well, I think Pakistan and India, and especially the Indian side, needs to be more assuring towards Pakistan, because Pakistani side has gone out of the way to give several significant gestures. The political leadership of Pakistan, the military leadership of Pakistan has given very clear gestures. They want to improve the ties, but they have not been responded to. And the elections are coming by, and clearly Indian view is that they would like to punish Pakistan, as they say. Sometimes we talk of surgical strikes, sometimes we talk of taking some sort of a forced action against Pakistan. And these voices keep coming up in one way or the other. So if any event, God forbid, takes place, Indians will want to take some sort of a coercive action against Pakistan. And they understand that the use of direct force is something that will be very difficult, because it will be responded to, it can de-escalate the situation. So one or two options that they have as a punishment, as we were to say, towards Pakistan is amendment of a treaty which can affect Pakistan. And that is where my worry lies, that decision-making in India will drift towards, making some sort of consideration towards this. So that's my concern. And therefore, I think Pakistan needs to talk with India and also towards the international community that, look, we have a situation here which relates to climate. We have a common resource of water which is not only shared by two countries but also by the entire region. There is Afghanistan, there is China, there is Bangladesh. For India, China is an upper riparian. For us, India is an upper riparian. There has to be a consistency in technical approach of water management towards the region, notwithstanding whatever the treaty says. So Pakistan needs to completely revisit its case and its posture towards water as an important issue that has been highlighted recently by the Supreme Court of Pakistan, but not only in the context of Supreme Court, but also in the context of climate change, in the regional context. And therefore, give a pushback to India that, look, this is an issue which is common, which is serious for the entire region to resolve. Don't attack the treaty right now. Make an effort to add value it, to improve it, to minimize disputes and that, and to bring it as a confidence-building measure as opposed to a measure that should be used as a threatening stick against any state.
Very well. Let's go into a very short break now. We appreciate all of our guests who have been speaking to us and adding their analysis and insight, of course, into this. We'll come back with our guest viewers after this very short break. Stay tuned. Thank you for staying with us, viewers, as we continue to discuss the Indus Waters Treaty. We still have with us Dr. Hassan Abbas, who is a water resources expert. He's joining us from Islamabad. We're also still joined by Ambassador Shafkat Kakhail, who is the chairperson of the board of the SDPI, the Sustainable Development Policy Institute. We're now going to add another voice to this conversation. We're joined now by Mr. Faisal Naqvi, who is a Lahore-based lawyer. He was also the Pakistan counsel for the Indus Waters Treaty. Mr. Naqvi, thanks for joining us here in the scope. I wanted to get your thoughts, Mr. Naqvi, of the contemporary status of this treaty. Of course, a lot of Pakistani concerns over the year. We can go through the timeline, of course, since essentially the 1970s, when Pakistan has regularly raised concerns about Indian actions vis-a-vis these rivers. What do you make of all that?
Pakistani concern over Indian projects on the rivers have essentially only really been operationalized since about 2000 or so, which is when the Baghdad debate got, heated up. Since then, we've had a Baghdad decision, which was, good for Pakistan in the sense it was the first time that our disputes were actually adjudicated. Not so good in the sense that the rationale given by the neutral expert was not in Pakistan's favor. But subsequently, or almost contemporaneously, Pakistan initiated the dispute resolution process in relation to the Kishanganga project, which worked out a lot better for us. Now, under the treaty, the level of disputes that you've actually got are very limited.
Okay.
There is really only one major issue under the treaty right now, which is to say the design of Indian projects in relation to, and specifically, the level of the outlets and to what extent they can be placed below what is called dead storage level. That is the point which was adjudicated in Bihar. The, I would say, philosophical basis for the placement of those levels at a outlet at a level not acceptable to Pakistan was then decided in Pakistan's favor. But the Kishanganga decision by a 7-member court of arbitration has then yet to be actually implemented, and that is where things stand. Once that is implemented and there is a subsequent decision in which the design of the Kishanganga project is changed, I think by and large, the extant issues under the treaty will be finished.
Okay, so let me go to Ambassador Shafkat, if I may. Ambassador, I wonder you make of going forward, especially we're going to Indian election season very soon. All of those political realities will have an impact, will they not? Will we see Indian adventurism when it comes to water? Because obviously, I would imagine from the Pakistanis' point of view that water would be, a major red line, wouldn't it?
Well, before we talk about the use of water in the Indian election, I would like to clarify that India has at no stage, including the period, the past few years when Prime Minister Modi has been at the helm of affairs, India has never threatened to walk out of the Indus Water Treaty. When Prime Minister Modi met with high officials to discuss the water issues, the first point that was agreed was that India will not ask for revisiting the Indus Water Treaty or for walking out of the Indus Water Treaty. So, in spite of the problems between the two countries on the design and specifications of the Indian hydropower projects, neither country has threatened to revisit or renegotiate or annul the Indus Water Treaty.
With due respect, Ambassador, and I do apologize for interrupting you, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe in 2016, in fact, India did say that it was at the very least reviewing the Indus Waters Treaty, and it linked it to, as Mr. Sufi had earlier said, to matters which are unrelated to the treaty specifically. Is that not, in a sense, a threat?
Well, because the treaty was negotiated in the 1950s, it does not deal with issues that have become more important or more relevant. For instance, the problems of climate change. Nobody talked about climate change in the 1950s. In the 1950s, nobody paid attention to the watershed management, which is extremely important for Pakistan because the watershed of the three western rivers is in areas either in India or areas controlled by India. The Indus Water Treaty also does not deal with groundwater.
Okay.
And the abstraction of groundwater by India can threaten the river flows. So there is also the question of how do you deal with the reduction in the water flows that may be caused by climate change or by prolonged droughts. So there are a number of issues that were not anticipated or that were not understood by the negotiators and therefore were not addressed by the treaty.
Ambassador, I'm going to come in just because we're running quickly out of time. I do apologize. I know this is a very long conversation, but Abbas, I wanted to give you the final word, if you allow me. Just very quickly, if you can, give us your final thoughts about the Indus Waters Treaty. What do you think should be happening as a next step?
Look, as a next step, I think we should be adopting the contemporary water management techniques, which are emerging actually all over the world and which are being practiced in so many advanced watersheds in the world, especially in North America, Australia, Europe, and Israel. There are quite a few myths about this treaty, which always come up. For example, one of the myths is that there were no international laws at the time the treaty was signed. There was a Madrid Declaration, which was to take the consent of the riparians within a hydrological regime, which was signed in 1911. Then there's the Article 4 of Geneva Convention. It talks about hydropower, that if anyone is making a hydropower project, it should not, by prejudice or by design, harm the lower riparians. Then there is Montevideo Declaration of 1933, which talks about industrial and agricultural water use between the international rivers. Then there are so many examples of treaties which are signed dating back to 1850s onward. And there is one very important thing, that before this treaty while this treaty was being negotiated, being proposed by Mr. Lilienthal, who was the ex-head of Tennessee Valley Authority, who is basically the main architect of this treaty and the whole system which came out of this treaty. This guy, he had written in 1951 in Collier magazine that if Pakistan goes to international court, Pakistan has a very strong case and Pakistan will win it. But that will not solve the water problems and war will break out. He said,
so just because the producer has bought me just a few more minutes, about a minute and a half, Mr. Naqvi, I'm gonna use that time to just get another from you. What do you think the next step should be for this treaty?
Look, the treaty as itself should stay where it is.
Okay.
There is no need to renegotiate or open the treaty. This is the best that Pakistan could possibly hope for. And anybody who thinks that it can be reopened in Pakistan's favor is, with great respect, delusional. There are additional matters not covered by the treaty which need to be addressed, such as climate change, such as watershed management, but those are additional matters. Okay. In terms of international law and the negotiation of the treaty, yes, everybody knew about them. If one goes through the archives of the Indus Water Commission, you can see that Pakistan worked very hard on the international law aspect, even sending, for example, delegates to the Dubrovnik Conference of 1956. We knew all of this. But can we please leave the treaty as it is?
We'll leave it at that as our final word. Gentlemen, we appreciate, of course, all of your time and your analysis and thoughts here in the scope. Let me thank all of our guests from the top. We were joined there by Dr. Hassan Abbas, water resources expert, speaking to us from the Pakistani capital, Islamabad. We were also joined by Ambassador Shafkat Kakakhiels, chairperson of the board of the Sustainable Development Policy Institute. We were also joined by Mr. Faisal Naqvi, Lahore-based lawyer. Earlier, we were joined by Mr. Ahmed Bilal Sufi, who's an international law expert. He was also speaking to us from Lahore as well. Viewers, as all of our guests across the board have spoken about, this treaty, of course, is an important one. The issue of water is an important one for Pakistan in the context of this treaty, and of course in the context of a world which is going through climate change and other such realities as well. But the other big reality, of course, is also politics within India, political realities within India as well. We'll keep a very close eye on how all of that plays out within the context of these Indus Waters Treaty here in The Scope. But thanks for watching. I'll be back, of course, after a short break with our next segment. Don't go anywhere. Thank you for staying with us, viewers, here in The Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. The Chinese and American trade delegations are meeting in an effort to resolve their row ahead of a March 2nd deadline that Trump announced before adding more tariffs on Chinese imports. The case against a Huawei executive is also overshadowing, global progress in technology, with 5G and other such vital new tech in the crosshairs. Is Trump carrying through his promise to put America first by ensuring his country's businesses remain superior? To discuss all of that a bit further, we're joined with Mr. Jamie Mulholland, who is a geopolitical analyst and China specialist. He's contributed to the University of Nottingham's Asia Research Institute, and he's joining us now via Skype from London. We're also joined by Mr. Ricardo Benusi, who is the Deputy Regional Manager at Dezan Shira and Associates. He's joining us there from Shanghai. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. Ricardo, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What do you make, Ricardo, of the current state of these U.S.-China trade dispute?
Well, thank you very much for having me on the program. And it is indeed, I think we're in the thick of the moment right now, because as we are speaking, Liu He and Robert Lighthizer, they are meeting, and if not at the end of the first day of meetings already in Washington. So there's a lot of expectation on what it will turn out to be. I think that we can safely say that we're expecting for positive outcomes before March the 1st or the 2nd, and before the tariffs will be, or new tariffs will be slapped on a number of goods. Mm-hmm. But I do have, from my perspective, which is the consulting side, the professional consulting side of foreign direct investment, from the Chinese perspective, a couple of comments. I mean, we are used to taking any statistics from the Chinese authorities with more than just a grain of salt, correct? So now that we're in this economic turmoil, which is especially ignited by some signs of lower consumption in China and the trade war itself, I think we need to be even more careful. Okay. But the real numbers that are interesting for us for the trade war are the ones that we need to focus on. But as much as we are and have to remain skeptical about the accuracy of the numbers reported by the Chinese government, which are the reflection, evidently, of the trade war, every second day we read about official announcements in Beijing level, or provincial level, or even here in Shanghai city level, or even Guangzhou, that concerning the GDPs aren't met, decline, growth is registered, and in general, the central government and some of the most financially important cities of China, such as this one, Shanghai, where I sit, and Guangzhou and Shenzhen, are keeping everybody on their toes, admitting some decline in the economy, and basically asking governments to cut local inefficient expenses, etc. Okay. But there's also many things that are the repercussion, the consequence, I think, of the trade war. Right. And these are, on the China side of things, because this is where we operate, it is the lowering of tariffs, and there's more welcoming of more trade with other partners, and these partners are countries. Mm-hmm. So definitely there's been a reduction of local taxes to reduce the stress on, for example, some of our manufacturing clients, or even domestic manufacturing companies. Yeah. To do what? To ease the tax pressure on these companies. Okay. And also to improve the foreign direct investment environment with upcoming regulations that will refreshen the FDI environment in this country.
Right. Okay. All right, so let me bring in Jamie then. Jamie, you're the point of view from a consultant and from somebody who works closely in this area. What do you make of the current situation, Jamie? What are you expecting to come out of these talks that are currently taking place?
Well, hopefully we can make some progress. I mean, neither side is going to win a trade war. A trade war can't really be won, especially in the case of China and the U.S., where the economies are so interconnected and the manufacturing as well. So if the US pushes too hard, it's going to push China to start developing more of their own in-house technology and to turn to other markets. And this is going to have an effect on the US market and the global market as a whole. So I'm hoping that there can be some compromise reached and a clarification of what each side wants in order to move forward.
And Jamie, what do you think the Chinese do want at this point in time then when it comes to these talks? Because, obviously we know that the biggest issue I imagine would be the tariffs. But then, Jamie, there is this huge case against this Huawei executive as well, which is overshadowing essentially these talks, isn't it?
Yes, for sure. For sure, China will like access, so they would not want to be blocked, for example, from government contracts for 5G in the UK, the US, Canada. That's, of course, something that they've been working really hard on, getting these big contracts, which really boost their name and their global penetration. And they're also taking issue with the trade war with the WTO and this idea that if China should follow the rules, then the US should follow the rules as well. And I think that's very much the Chinese perspective on the issue.
Okay, Ricardo, I'll try with you once again, if I may. What do you think, Ricardo, should be happening next when it comes to trade between these two countries? Because, they both are powerhouses, and as we've already agreed upon, all of us, this is hurting both sides.
Your question is what is the desired outcome, because these two economies are the two largest in the world, and we are expecting specific positive consequences? Is this what you asked?
Yes, something along those lines. Yes, something along those lines. Yeah.
Well, it is highly desirable that there's a positive outcome for both economies. I think that it goes without saying that there is a solid portion of irrationality in some of the choices that the U.S. administration has laid out in the last year that have brought to an escalation, irrational escalation of this trade war. The fact that now Trump is, as you know, back into campaigning, he needs to come out of this trade war and the pause, the truce that has been in the trade war, in a positive way for the U.S. electors, for the U.S. In general, for the West, because let's take for example labor. Mm-hmm. If the trade war has been oriented for the United States perspective to bring back jobs or create new jobs in the U.S., unfortunately, this has not reflected in the outcomes of the war yet. If anything, the jobs that have ceased to exist in China due to the trade war have now reappeared or taken place in Southeast Asia. Because again, from my perspective, the Chinese, the firms, the foreign firms that have invested in China, are not leaving China entirely. Okay. If anything, they're trying to restructure and relocate to Southeast Asia.
Okay, before going to my break, in fact, I'm going to pick up on that point you made there, Ricardo. Jamie, do you think, as Chinese official at Davos said, Jamie, that China is a lot more resilient an economy than many in the world have given it credit for? Do you think that China will come out of this A-OK and that it will look for other greener pastures as well to trade with?
Talking to industry insiders in China, they were working in the steel industry. They were saying that they've already negotiated prices very far into the future, and that a lot of the products they're making, people in the US cannot make them. So the companies have no choice but to buy at the agreed prices and then pay the tariffs and then pass on those costs onto the US consumers. And financially, I think that China has much more in the way of financial reserves and resource reserves than the US. So they're in a position to weather it out. And then we have the Belt and Road Initiative, where China is, investing significantly in infrastructure across Eurasia and breaking into new markets. So while the US is a valued and important market, China's in a position to diversify, where I think US is already in all the market that it's going to get in. I don't think they're ability to diversify is the same as China.
Okay, viewers, we're just going to go very quickly into a short break. We'll be back, of course, with the rest of this very important topic about the China-U.S. trade war. We're going to discuss Huawei a bit more in detail after this break. Stay with us for that. Thank you for staying with us, viewers, as we continue our discussion on the U.S.-China trade war, that meeting happening right now. And of course, we're now going to be talking a bit about that case on Huawei and the executive being arrested there in Canada, the U.S. seeking extradition of her to the United States. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined still by Mr. Ricardo Benusi, who's Deputy Regional Manager at Desan Shira and Associates. He's joining us from Shanghai still. We're also now joined by Mr. Einar Tangen, who is a political and economic affairs commentator, and he is joining us from Beijing. Einar, thank you for your time once again and joining us here in The Scope. Einar, give us your thoughts at this point in time. When we look at this case in Huawei, and obviously it's overshadowing, I imagine, these talks, at the very least the spirit of these talks that are currently occurring between these two delegations. What are your thoughts on that case? Is this, do you think, and I'm just hypothesizing at this point in time, an effort by the U.S. to almost limit or try to limit China's growing strength when it comes to technology?
Well, yes, you hit it on the head. I mean, this is a purely political ploy that's being used. Basically, Donald Trump, he likes to put his opponents a little off their game. As you recall, he was firing missiles at Syria over the desert when he was sitting down with Xi Jinping in Mar-a-Lago. And even during this last round of intermediate talks, he was sailing ships before the talks. He was sailing ships through the Taiwan Straits, and then after the talks, during the talks, he was sailing ships within 12 miles of the Disputed Islands in the South China Sea. I think from his point of view, from a real estate, he thinks that this is very clever to put somebody off their game, but I don't think he understands that this has kind of become see-through, and that, quite frankly, the Chinese have a playbook where they anticipate that these types of things are going to happen.
Ricardo, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think this is genuinely just America putting itself first, looking out for the interests of its own companies at this time?
Oh, that's a very good question. In fact, I think that a trade war between giants of the economy is nothing new to China and the U.S. There have been many in history, but based on economical constraints, based on dire situations in one or other economy. But apparently, Trump is actually embracing this protectionism for what it represents. So this, compared to other presidencies and administrations in the U.S. in terms of trade war against other economies, would make them quite unique, so to say. So this initiation of these barriers are actually very strong, and domestic industries right now are probably not even requesting this kind of, or this level of protectionism. This is something that has been widely confirmed. But this is, as Einar said, who I've have the pleasure to meet 9 years ago in Beijing, is actually the main point of the character of Trump. So being caught off guard and waiting for tweets to suddenly turn things around and turn the tables around. But I think that the general environment around China and U.S. is fourfold. There's the military talk, the political talk, technological talk, and the economy. And the Huawei case, for example, is in the technology, where there's also intellectual property and transfer of technology. And in economy, and the economical pillar, there's the trade. Yeah. So they're quite separate. But there are things that China is doing strongly, and I think that, if I may, we as in the consulting industry, we have the particular view on the trade war, which is the view from the small medium enterprise or the multinational enterprise. So we follow the money, and then we analyze what is going on. We don't necessarily go into the politics, and that's why I appreciate the diversity of the audience today.
Right. But, so if I may, Ricardo, I'd like to bring Einar back in. Einar, many people looking from the outside in our, and again, I'm hypothesizing here, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this view, but many people would say, Einar, that this is in fact less about the military aspects, or even the other aspects that we may discuss, but this is in fact a lot about just Trump as a businessman putting, as he promised that he would really, putting America first. Does this put America first, or does this in fact hurt America a lot more in the long run?
Well, actually, right now it's hurting America. I mean, if you look at the Bank of America report that they put out, it's quite clear that if the second round of tranches were to actually go through, they're estimating that the damage to the American economy would be greater than to the Chinese economy. And quite frankly, what you have here is a schism between these hawks and the Pentagon, some of the defense side, and the corporate side, who are very, very concerned about this. The uncertainty that this is causing people to sit on their hands in terms of investment. Some people are expecting a recession in 12 to 16 months, mainly due to this kind of economic uncertainty that Trump has been pushing for the last year. So at this point, I would say that Trump is hitting all the buttons. I know Ricardo said there are 4, but I think he pushes them kind of randomly like a child, thinking that something will happen, that, that this is more of like a slot machine and that he could hit it lucky. I don't think there's a lot of strategy involved in this. I certainly don't think that he has an economic plan or strategy that fits to any kind of known economic policy. Peter Navarro is a unit of one in terms of his economics. So at this point, it's anyone's guess what is going to happen next. He seems to always confound us when we think we've hit the bottom.
Einar, we just have a minute left, so I'm going to give you the final word, if you allow me. What do you think will happen next, Einar? Do you think that at a time when Apple shares, profits, are falling worldwide, especially, of course, in China since this trade war began, do you think that American companies, let me put it this way, will realize that siding with Trump, or at the outset, they may have sided with Trump in this trade war? Do you think that they will realize this is the wrong path even for them?
Well, that realization is already there, and to put it bluntly, they have no interest in him going forward on this particular track. I think you can expect Donald Trump to seize what he believes is the brass ring. He'll be very interested in getting, if he can, $1 trillion offer from the Chinese side to buy a lot of things. It won't address the structural issues, but it'll make the market go up and his polling, which is most important to him.
All right, we'll leave that as our final word there with Einar. Let me thank all of our guests there from the top. We were joined there by Ricardo Benussi, Deputy Regional Manager of Dazon Shira and Associates, speaking to us from Shanghai. We were joined by Mr. Einar Tangen, Political and Economic Affairs Commentator, speaking to us from Beijing. And we were also earlier joined by Jamie Mulholland, Geopolitical Analyst and China Specialist, who is speaking to us from London. We appreciate, of course, their time, their analysis and insight as they provided in this discussion. Now, viewers, as all of our guests spoke about, these talks taking place right now between the Chinese and American delegations over this trade war are extremely important. Not a lot of optimism about what may happen because the Huawei executive case, of course, overshadows these talks at this time. China saying it's being unfairly targeted, or its business, i.e. Huawei's telecom business, is being unfairly targeted at a time that we know that Huawei has the upper hand at this point in time globally. We'll keep a very close eye on all those developments and others here in The Scope, but thanks for watching this edition. I've been Waqar.